The problem with the kiwat and muskeg wasn't the isolation, it was the silence. It was a thick, absorbent silence that swallowed sound within 50 feet. It was a physical pressure. You'd shout, and the sound would die, stolen by the moss and stagnant water. I was a seasonal surveyor, paid to chart the slow, creeping advance of the peat bog as it swallowed the boreal forest in northern Manitoba. My camp was a small, elevated aluminum platform, a tiny, four-legged square of rigid metal in a world of sinking, saturated ground. It was 3 miles from the nearest logging road, which itself was an hour's drive from anything you'd call a town. For the first week, the silence was a balm. It was a relief from the noise of the city, a clean, empty canvas. The only sounds were the maddening, high-pitched whine of mosquitoes, the occasional mournful cry of a loon across the stagnant, tea-colored water, and the constant wet squelch pop of my boots pulling free from the muck. The second week, the woods started listening. It began with the loon. Its call would echo across the bog, a wild, haunting yodel that defined the north. It was a sound of pure, untamed wilderness. And then, a second or two later, a reply would come from the dense spruce to the south. But the reply was wrong. It wasn't just too deep, it was too physical. The real loon's call was air and spirit. This was a guttural, forceful bellow that tried to match the pitch but failed, as if a much larger animal was trying to force the sound from an unpracticed, unsuitably large throat. It sounded less like a bird and more like a bear striking a hollow log. I told myself it was a bull moose, or maybe the echo distorting, but I knew I was lying. A few days later, I was checking a perimeter stake, kneeling to read the measure, the smell of sulfur and decay rising from the disturbed peat. A sound, a heavy, wet thump, made me look up. A large white-tailed doe bolted from the brush, eyes white and rolling, foam flecking its muzzle. The rank smell of its panic hitting me like a wave. It was in a blind terror and nearly ran me over before veering at the last second and crashing into the bog water, swimming desperately for the far bank. I stood still, heart hammering, and listened. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, from the direction the deer had fled, I heard a sharp snap. Not the snap of a twig, but a percussive, vocal click. Then a wet, airy snort wheeze, a perfect, awful imitation of the deer's last alarm call. It was followed by a new sound, a clumsy, wet crashing, mimicking the deer's panicked flight. But the sound wasn't moving. It was stationary. It was practicing the noise of terror, dissecting it. I heard the snort wheeze again, then the crashing sound, then the click, as if it was testing the sequence. I packed my sidearm from then on, a heavy .44 Magnum I usually kept for bears. It felt absurdly useless. What do you shoot? A sound, an echo. The thing was a ghost made of mud, and I felt like a child with a cap gun. The nights became a trial of acoustics. The thing would circle my platform, always just outside the feeble, mist-diffused ring of my headlamp. It never showed itself. It just practiced. I would cough, a dry tickle from the damp air. From the darkness would come a hollow, chesty, like someone beating a waterlogged drum. I would zip up my tent, the zip cutting the night. A moment later, a long, sibilant would be hissed from the trees, loud as a punctured air hose. I sat, sharpening my utility knife. The sound came back, replicated by 2 large stones clacking together from the bog. It was slower, more deliberate. It was listening to itself. I poured water from my canteen. From the shadows, a deep, wet gurgle, like something drowning. It was learning. It was learning me. It was building a library of my existence, one sound at a time. The true horror began on Tuesday. I had a small, battery-powered radio for weather updates. The 7:00 p.m. forecast was my only human contact, a lifeline to a world that wasn't trying to tear me apart and study the pieces. As the tinny, crackling voice of the announcer from Thompson read off the barometric pressure, a new sound joined the night. It was a low, resonant rumble. It sounded like a man humming along to the broadcast. I turned the radio off, my hand shaking so violently I almost dropped it. The humming continued. It rose in volume, perfectly matching the cadence and rhythm of the announcer's voice, but with no words. Just a low, melodic, vibrating mimicry of the speech pattern. I could feel it in the platform's aluminum legs, a thrum that came up from the peat itself and into my bones. It felt like an engine, idling somewhere in the dark. I sat in my tent, gun in my lap, paralyzed. It wasn't just mimicking, it was analyzing, deconstructing human speech into pure, tonal structure. The humming went on for an hour, practicing the rhythm of the dead broadcast. Then it stopped. The silence that rushed in was heavier than before, suffocating. I held my breath, straining my ears. Beep. A perfect, clear, digital beep. The sound of my radio turning on. But my radio was off, clutched in my left hand, the plastic warm from my sweat. The sound had come from the bog. It was followed by a flawless imitation of static and then a sharp click, the sound of the radio turning off. It wasn't just mimicking me or the animals. It was mimicking my tools, my technology. It understood that the box made the voice. A cold, alien dread settled over me. This wasn't an animal. This was an intelligence. I didn't sleep. I didn't even lie down. I decided to hike out at first light, protocol be damned. As the sun's first weak gray rays filtered through the black spruce, I packed my gear. Every sound I made was a betrayal. I wrapped my metal canteen in a shirt to muffle it. I eased my tent poles apart instead of letting them snap. I buckled my pack straps with agonizing slowness, my hands shaking so badly I could barely thread the nylon. I felt like a mouse trying to sneak past a sleeping cat, but the cat was the entire bog, and it was wide awake. I froze, my pack half on. It was the sound of a heavy boot pulling free from deep mud. It was my sound, my boot, my weight. It came from 50 yards to my left, near a dense stand of tamaracks. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. It was walking, but it wasn't walking on the bog. It was too heavy. I could hear the deep, sucking thud as something immense displaced the peat. It wasn't just walking, it was wading, pulling feet the size of buckets free of the muck. I saw it then. It was half hidden, but the weak light caught its profile. It was impossibly tall, a 9-foot wall of muscle and shadow. It was covered in what looked less like fur and more like dripping black moss and strands of peat. Its shape was only vaguely humanoid, a mockery of a bipedal form, its shoulders impossibly wide, its arms long enough to nearly brush the ground. Dragonflies and mosquitoes crawled over its skin as if it were just another part of the landscape. It smelled of centuries of decay, of methane and deep, cold earth. It was turned away from me, seemingly focused on the mud at its feet. The sound came again. I realized with a cold drop in my stomach that the creature wasn't moving. It was standing still. It was making the sound. It was practicing my walk. It lifted one massive mud-caked foot, placed it down, and listened intently to the squelch pop it created. It tilted its head. It lifted the foot again, shifted its weight, and placed it down with more of a rolling motion. The sound was closer. Perfect. It nodded, a slow, horrifyingly human gesture. It turned, slowly. The movement was fluid, like water flowing uphill. I couldn't see a face, just a deep, shadowed cavity in the moss of its head. It raised one massive arm, and it spoke. In a perfect, tinny, static-laced imitation of the radio announcer, it said, "Clear skies tonight, see," with a low of 5 degrees, ksh, for the northern. The thing tilted its head, a slow, curious gesture, as if listening to the quality of its own voice, savoring the new syllables. It took one step toward me. The ground shuddered. It opened its mouth, a dark, wet tear in the moss and peat, a feature that hadn't been there a second before. It spoke again in my voice, but with a new, curious, upward inflection. A question. It had finished practicing. It had learned the sounds. Now, it wanted to understand the meaning. "Hello?" Jason pulled his Forerunner into the muddy, rutted apology for a parking lot. This was it, the trailhead for the Widow's Spine. It wasn't on any official park map. You had to know someone who knew someone, or, like Jason, spend 3 months cross-referencing old Forestry Service logs with topographical data. He prided himself on this. He was an off-piste hiker, a solo bagger of peaks, the forums deemed expert only. The thrill wasn't just the view, it was the isolation. He checked his gear one last time. GPS beacon, satellite phone, though he doubted he'd get a signal. Bear spray, knife, headlamp, and enough food for 4 days. He'd be up and back in 2. He clicked his trekking poles together, locked the truck, and stepped under the canopy of ancient, moss-draped hemlocks. The first 5 miles were standard, a grueling, calf-burning ascent. But as he gained altitude, the forest changed. The normal sounds of the Pacific Northwest, the chatter of squirrels, the scolding of jays, the distant thwack-thwack of a woodpecker, faded. It wasn't a gradual quieting. It was as if he'd crossed an invisible line. The air became heavy, still. The forest floor was a sound-deadening carpet of moss and pine needles, but this was different. This was a held-breath silence. He stopped to drink, and the only sound was the synthetic schluff of his own jacket and the pounding of his pulse in his ears. He felt a prickle on his neck. The "somebody's watching me" feeling. He laughed it off. "Just the squirrels you scared off, man," he muttered. He kept climbing. By late afternoon, he found a small, level clearing to make camp. As he unrolled his tent, he noticed the smell. It wasn't the clean, loamy scent of the forest. This was a thick, musky odor, like a wet dog rolled in ammonia, with an underlying coppery tang like old blood. He scanned the tree line, hand drifting to his bear spray. "Grizzly?" he whispered. Unlikely this high up, but not impossible. The smell faded as quickly as it came, carried off by a sudden cold breeze. He ate a dehydrated meal, the only sound the scrape of his spork against the metal-lined bag. As dusk painted the sky in bruises of purple and gray, the silence returned, heavier this time. Then, it was broken. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a snap. It was a sound, and it was wrong. It was a low, resonant thrum. He felt it in his sternum before he heard it, a vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. Like a colossal, distorted heartbeat. It was followed by a sharp, percussive crack that echoed across the ridge, the unmistakable sound of a thick, living tree being split in 2. Jason scrambled out of his tent. The thrumming stopped. The silence rushed back in, suffocating. He aimed his headlamp into the woods. The beam illuminated nothing but a wall of black-barked trees and the old man's beard hanging from their branches. He told himself it was geology, wind in a cave, a tree falling. But he knew with a cold certainty he was lying. He zipped his tent flap so tight the zipper strained and sat in the dark, knife in hand, until a fitful sleep claimed him. He woke to a cold gray dawn. The first thing he registered was the smell. It was back, and it was inside his tent vestibule. He froze. He heard a slow, wet snuffling sound right outside the nylon. Then he saw the print. He'd packed up in a panic, skipping breakfast. He was 500 yards from his campsite when he saw it, pressed deep into a patch of mud near a stream. It was enormous, at least 20 inches long. But it wasn't the size that made Jason's blood run cold. It was the shape. It wasn't a bear. The toes were too long, too distinct. The arch was impossibly high. And it was bare. A footprint. He followed the stream, moving fast, his wilderness survival guide brain warring with the primal terror screaming in his skull. He had to get above the tree line, out of the woods, into the open. He heard it again, the thrum. This time, it was closer. He didn't look back. He scrambled up a sheer rock face, his trekking poles scraping uselessly. He could hear it moving in the dense forest to his left, paralleling him. It wasn't running, it wasn't crashing, it was pacing him. A massive snap of a branch, far too large for a man or bear to break, echoed from the trees. He'd stop. The sound would stop. He'd move. It would move. It was toying with him. He broke into a small clearing, a field of talus and scrub. He stopped to catch his breath, his lungs burning. "Show yourself, damn it," he screamed, his voice small and thin. The thrumming stopped. The forest was dead quiet. He turned in a slow circle, and he saw it. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the shadow of a massive fir. It was a violation of geometry. Too tall to be real, its silhouette a jagged tear in the fabric of the twilight. 9, maybe 10 feet tall. It was covered in matted fur the color of wet rot and shadow, its arms so long the knuckles brushed the ground. Jason's mind tried to categorize it. Bear, man, ape. It was none of them. It was other. It stepped out of the shadow. The smell of ammonia and old blood hit him like a physical blow. He saw the muscles like coiled ropes, moving under the patchy, filthy hide. But the face, God, the face. It was not an ape. It was not a man. It was a terrible, ancient parody of both. The brow was low and heavy, but the eyes were not animal. They were twin pits of black oil, reflecting the gray sky with a terrible, patient understanding. It wasn't roaring. It wasn't beating its chest. It was just watching him. It had let him get this far. It had herded him here. What are you?" Jason whispered, his legs shaking. The creature tilted its head, a gesture of uncanny, human-like curiosity. Then it opened its mouth. No roar came out, no guttural growl. A sound did. A perfect, clear, electronic beep, beep, beep. Jason's blood turned to ice. It was the sound of his satellite phone self-testing when he'd turned it on that morning. It had been listening. All day. The creature took a slow step. Jason scrambled backward, falling over his pack. The beast mimicked him, dropping to one knee in a grotesque pantomime. Then, a new sound. A thin, high-pitched click-clack. Jason screamed. It was the sound of his trekking poles on the rocks. It was learning. It stood to its full, terrifying height. It raised a hand the size of a shovel and pointed. Not at Jason. It pointed back down the mountain. Back the way he had come. It was giving him a choice, or a command. Jason didn't need to be told twice. He crab-walked backward, grabbed his pack, and ran. He ran, blind with terror, sliding on scree, stumbling through thickets. He didn't look back, but he could hear it. It wasn't following, it was just standing there. He ran until his lungs were fire and his legs were jelly. He fell, rolled, and came to a stop at the bottom of a ravine, his ankle twisting with a sickening pop. He cried out, a sound that was half sob, half scream. The forest was silent. He lay there for a long time, whimpering, as the adrenaline faded and the agonizing throb of his ankle set in. He was trapped. He was injured. It would be dark in an hour. It was over. He lay on the cold ground, waiting. He heard the thrum again, distant, up on the ridge. Then, from the darkness, he heard a new sound. It was a perfect mimicry of his own cry of pain. The thing wasn't a predator, it was a proprietor. It wasn't hunting him for food, it was evicting him for trespassing. Darkness fell. He lay in the ravine, shivering, drifting in and out of consciousness. He dreamed of black, oily eyes and the click-clack of his own steps. When he woke, it was dawn. He was alone. The smell was gone. The forest was alive. A bird was singing, a real bird. He splinted his ankle with a branch and one of his trekking poles. It took him 2 days to crawl and hobble the 10 miles back to his truck. Every snapping twig made him jump. Every shadow held a 10-foot nightmare. When he finally reached the forerunner, he found a single, massive 20-inch footprint pressed into the mud next to the driver's side door, as if it had come down to see him off, to make sure he was leaving. Jason never hiked again. He sold his gear. He moved to a condo in the city. He told the doctors he fell and broke his ankle. But sometimes, on very quiet nights, when the building's air conditioning kicks in, he feels a low, resonant thrum in his chest. And he remembers the silence, the smell, and the terrible, patient understanding in those eyes. He knows he didn't escape. He was released. George was 73, and his property was the only thing he had left that listened. His wife, dead 10 years. His kids, scattered to distant concrete cities with no trees and no silence. All he had was 3 acres of stubborn, rocky soil, pressed up against the granite teeth of the Siskiyou Mountains. The forest was more than a boundary. It was a sheer, dark green wall that started exactly 20 yards from his back porch. A silent audience that watched him grow old. He was clearing brush, a task he'd performed every autumn for 40 years. The work was a brutal argument with his lower back, but he liked the neatness of it. He liked the clear, sharp, defiant line between his yard and the woods. It was a small victory, a pushing back of the inevitable green tide. That's when he smelled it. It wasn't the usual pine, damp earth, and decaying leaves. This was thick, heavy, and fundamentally wrong. It smelled like a wet dog rolled in spoiled milk, a sour, cloying stench. Underneath it was a sharp, coppery tang, like a mouthful of old pennies. It was a predator smell, but one no book had ever described. It made his stomach clench and his eyes water. He pushed aside a curtain of wild blackberry vines, the thorns snagging his canvas jacket, and saw the print. George was no stranger to tracks. He knew the delicate cloven heart of a deer, the heavy, clawed shuffle of a bear, and the rare, soft, padded threat of a mountain lion. This was none of those. It was massive, a good 18 inches long, and sunk impossibly deep into the hard-packed, root-laced soil, where his own boots left barely a scuff. It was shaped like a human foot, but the toes were too long, splayed wide like roots, the big toe jutting slightly inward. "Drunk hunter," he muttered, the words sounding thin and foolish even to himself. Some fool in a joke boot. But no boot made a print this deep, this fleshy, with the clear impression of skin texture in the mud. He poked at the edge with his rake handle. The soil was cold. He backed away, the acrid smell seeming to stick to the inside of his nose, a greasy film in his lungs. He went inside, checking the deadbolt, locking his door an hour earlier than usual. The sun was still up, but the house felt dark. That night the sounds started. He was used to the forest's night noises, the sharp crack of a twig, the muffled hoot of a great horned owl, the distant frantic yip of coyotes. This was different. This was heavy. A long pause, long enough for George to think he'd imagined it. It was a rhythm, a heavy, laborious, limping gait that circled his house just beyond the weak yellow puddle of his porch lamp. George sat in his lazy boy, his old 12-gauge, heavy with dust, across his knees. The sound was methodical. It wasn't an animal foraging, it wasn't a lost hiker. It was pacing, measuring, a slow, patient perimeter check of his tiny wooden box. It went on for an hour, a maddening, relentless cadence that seemed to vibrate in his chest. Then, silence so sudden it was louder than the noise. The next morning, he found the first gift. On his woodshed door, 3 long, coarse, dark red hairs were snagged on a nail. He plucked one off. It was thicker than horsehair, stiff and bristly as a boar's. He looked up, following the line of the door, and his breath hitched. High on the shed's outer wall, a good 10 feet off the ground, well above his own reach, even with the rake, were 5 long, parallel scratches, deep enough to splinter the old wood and show the pale pine beneath. He spent the day inside, methodically cleaning his rifle, oiling the action until it slid with a satisfying click. He checked the brittle caulking on his windows. The sun felt thin, offering no warmth, no comfort. The woods just watched. The thud, drag returned just after dusk, but this time it was closer. He heard it on his porch. He heard the old boards creak and groan, protesting a weight he couldn't or wouldn't imagine. He flicked on the porch light, his heart hammering against his ribs. There was nothing there, only the smell. It was so strong now it was like a physical presence, a greasy fog seeping under the door, tainting the air in his home. He sat in the dark, watching the pale, ghostly square of his living room window, and he saw it. It moved at the edge of the tree line, a silhouette against the thin slice of a rising moon. It was a lie, a trick of the dark, It had to be. It was impossibly tall, a jagged column of shadow that dwarfed the young pines he'd planted himself 30 years ago. Its arms, thick as fence posts, hung almost to its knees. It stood for a full minute, utterly still, and George felt a sensation he hadn't felt since he was a small child, lost in the woods. He was being looked at, stared at, known, seen. It turned, and he saw the source of the limping sound. One leg was shorter, twisted at a sickening, unnatural angle, the foot dragging uselessly as it moved. It didn't walk like an animal. It moved like a broken man, a giant, broken man. It disappeared back into the blackness of the trees without a sound. George didn't sleep. A few days passed in dreadful, ringing silence. No sounds, no tracks. The oppressive smell faded, carried away on the breeze. George started to breathe again. He convinced himself it was a bear, a big, sick, malformed bear. A vagrant. He'd done his brush clearing. It hadn't liked the noise, and it had moved on. He was safe. On the third day, emboldened by the sun, he decided to finish the job. He went to the far edge of his property, where the old fence had collapsed into a pile of rotting posts. The area was clean. All the brush he'd intended to clear was gone. The fallen branches, the thickets of thornapple, the piles of dead leaves, all of it had been pulled up and dragged away. The ground was swept bare, right down to the dark, damp earth. In the center of the clearing, on the flat top of a mossy boulder, was the second gift. It was a doe. It wasn't torn apart, not fed on, not ravaged by claws. It was arranged. Its legs had been broken at the joints and folded neatly under it like a sleeping fawn. Its head was tilted back, its mouth open. But its fur, its long brown and white winter fur, had been braided. Intricate, complex, horrifyingly tight knots and weaves ran from its neck to its tail, woven with a surgical, obsessive precision. Woven into the braids were twigs of bright red maple, 3 black crow feathers, and sprigs of the blackberry vines George had been cutting. It was a sculpture. It was a threat. It was art. George threw up, his stomach rebelling. He stumbled back to his house, the world tilting and sliding. This wasn't an animal. An animal didn't tidy. An animal didn't mimic. An animal didn't braid. A storm broke that night, a howling, violent thing that threw rain against the house, like handfuls of gravel. The wind shrieked, a high-pitched, mournful sound in the eaves. And in the momentary lulls, George heard a new sound, a low, gurgling sound, a wet, throaty huff. It was coming from above him. It was on the roof. He heard the thud, drag move across the shingles, a sound so heavy he was sure the old roof beams would crack. The house shuddered. It stopped directly over his living room. He sat in his chair, shotgun aimed at the ceiling, his arms shaking so hard he could barely hold it. Then came the scratching. Not at a door or window. It was coming from the fireplace. A scraping, tearing sound of claws on brick from inside the chimney. George scrambled back, knocking over his lamp. The room plunged into darkness, lit only by the strobing flashes of lightning. A sound like a cannon shot. Bricks, mortar, and a cloud of 100-year-old soot blasted into the room, stinging his eyes, filling his mouth with grit. Rain and wind tore down the new jagged opening. George screamed as a thing reached down from the ruined flue. It was an arm, pale gray and ropey with muscle, covered in the same matted dark red hair. It was too long. The joints were wrong. The hand was a gnarled claw, a spider of bone and sinew with cracked yellow talons that scraped the floorboards. The arm was followed by a head. It pushed through the wreckage, its immense shoulders stuck tight in the brickwork. In the flash of lightning, George saw its face. It was not an ape. It was a grotesque, ancient, eroded parody of a man. The skin was stretched like wet parchment over a protruding, bony brow and a slack, gaping jaw. Its eyes were milky, blind-looking orbs that seemed to glow with a sick, pale light of their own. It was stuck. It writhed, twisting its massive torso, and let out a low, guttural roar of frustration that vibrated the floor, rattling the pictures on the wall. It stared at George, its head cocked, its wet, lipless mouth opened, and it spoke. It wasn't a word. It was a perfect, gurgling, wet-throated imitation of his dead wife, a sound he hadn't heard in a decade, a sound that lived only in his deepest memories. George, the sound, a wet, drawn-out mimicry from a throat that wasn't designed for it, broke George's terror. It shattered the fear and left only a core of pure animal rage. He bellowed, a sound torn from his own throat, and fired the 12-gauge. The blast was deafening in the small room. The thing shrieked, a high-pitched sound of metal tearing, and retracted with violent, impossible speed. George heard a colossal, thudding collapse on the roof, a shower of broken shingles, then the thud, drag fading with terrifying speed, disappearing into the storm. He sat there until dawn, covered in soot and rainwater, his empty shotgun on his lap, staring at the raw, gaping hole in his house. He didn't leave for a week. He boarded up the fireplace with planks from his kitchen table. He ate cold beans from a can, listening to every creak. He just waited. Finally, the hunger and the need for firewood drove him out. He unbolted the front door, his rifle in his hands, and stepped onto the porch. His jaw dropped. The entire yard was clean, immaculate. All the fallen branches from the storm, the scattered leaves, the piles of brush he'd abandoned, all gone. The lawn was swept bare, as if by a giant's broom. The line between his yard and the woods was perfect, sharp, and clean. The job was finished. He stood there baffled, a cold, sick hope rising in him. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe it was just trying to help? Then he looked down. On his doormat, placed perfectly in the center, was a small, tight braid. It was woven from dead grass, a strip of deer sinew, and strands of long, silver blonde hair. The hair from the antique locket on his nightstand. The locket that held the last clipping of his wife's hair. He looked up at the dark, silent wall of trees. It was still out there. It could get in. It could take things. It could learn. And it knew he liked things tidy. George backed into his house, the rifle shaking. He bolted the door. The yard had never looked so clean, and the world had never felt so full of looming, patient, ancient horror.